Well, that was a pretty disappointing game because the Clippers just smashed the Mavericks. They absolutely obliterated them, and a lot of this comes down to the adjustments that Ty Lue has finally made. And we got to give him credit because although it probably took about a game longer than I would have expected, he made the adjustments. And you can talk about Luka's injuries all you want. That's definitely a concern, and he did look underdone. He didn't look the same as what he has been in the 3 games prior. But just in general, the Clippers were starting to make rotations. They were still protecting the rim even without the presence of Ivica Zubac, and they just looked more connected defensively. They actually looked like a team that was one of the championship favorites for a reason. And well, not to be the guy, but I thought it was a little bit premature to call this series over because when you have Kawhi Leonard on the other team, a series isn't over at 2-0. When you have Kawhi on the other team, a series is not over, and that's evidenced by the fact he's now scored about 80 points over the last 2 games. The game's not even over at this point, so I don't know what points he's going to end up with, but he's scored about 70 points over the last 2 games and missed like 10 shots. And he's been great defensively. He's starting to protect the rim. He's getting in the passing lanes. He's starting to attack, drive, and kick. The Mavericks have no answer for him one-on-one. No team in the NBA has ever had an answer for him one-on-one. That's never going to happen. So you've got to double team him. And that's why the Clippers have been so dangerous this year, because when you choose to double team him, all of a sudden you've got Marcus Morris, Nicholas Batum, Paul George, and whoever else is on the floor at the time spotting up. That's a recipe for a disaster, and that's why all of a sudden you take out Zubac. Not only does it help you defensively, because now you can start to switch onto Luka, and you can start to switch everything because Porzingis isn't really taking advantage of his height. Also offensively, you're getting more of those drive and kicks, and the Clippers, they're getting a lot more open looks from 3. I mean, they could have knocked down 50% of their threes. Pretty much all of their shots were open because it's coming from Kawhi Leonard attacking the paint, and he's either getting straight to the rim and scoring, like he's been doing, or he's kicking it out to an open shooter, which is a bit of an issue for the Mavs because right now they're not looking like a team that is going to be able to handle this Clippers team for the next couple of games. I'm not going to call it too early either because it was premature to call the Mavs having won the series 2 games ago. It's also premature to say the Clippers have won this series now because even though Luka looks hurt, anything can happen. Hardaway Jr. had a 1 of 8 shooting night. Dorian Finney-Smith was 2 of 8. Maxi Kleber was 0 of 3. Jalen Brunson 2 of 7. You get the point. None of their guys outside of Luka, I mean, Luka was 9 of 23 as well. None of their guys shot the 3-ball well, and this is a team that's going to need to put up 120 points to win like they did in the first 2 games, which they're capable of. They're definitely capable of doing it, but the Clippers are making it tougher now because they're actually starting to rotate. They're actually starting to make the right switches because instead of switching Zubac onto Luka, now it's Batum, now it's George, now it's Leonard, and all of a sudden there's not just easy buckets to be had. It's not Patrick Beverley getting posted up and getting scored on 5 times in a row before he gets taken out of the game. Now you bring in Terrence Mann. Luka's still going to make his shots, but all of a sudden the Clippers are actually looking like a team that was feared for a reason and were the favorites in this series for a reason. Now, actually, before I forget to say it, if you could drop a like on the video right now, if you're watching, subscribe to the channel if you're new, making content like this every single day, and doing so just helps out how the video goes a ton. But what I was saying is the Clippers are starting to look connected on both ends of the floor, and it is a little bit of a scary sight for the Mavericks. I'm not going to lie. Like I mentioned, Luka doesn't look 100%. He's not 100%. He's got an injury, and well, he was relied on heavily in the first 3 games. He was still relied on in game 4, and if he's not giving you 35 points a night, it looks like the production's going to be hard to come by because Hardaway Jr. was my X factor heading into this series. I said he needed to average about 22 to 25 for Dallas to win. All of a sudden, the last 2 games, he shot terribly. He hasn't played very well, and the Mavericks have lost. I'm not saying that's the absolute correlation to their losses, but it's a big reason because he's a guy that can be that second option on a given night, but he can also play like a bench player on a given night. So that's the difference in consistency. And you're starting to see the consistency in Paul George versus Hardaway Jr. That's the difference right now, in my opinion. Through the first 2 games, Luka and Kawhi, Luka was playing better, but Kawhi was still playing like a superstar. And then Paul George and Hardaway Jr. were actually playing at a similar level. Now, all of a sudden, Paul George has continued his play, and THJ has dropped off a lot. That's what I'm seeing in terms of offense. And then, like I mentioned, defense, the Clippers are actually starting to make it hard for them. I know, who would have thought getting rid of Zubac, getting rid of Beverly, putting in Terrence Mann, putting in Rondo, putting in Batum, all guys that can defend, all guys that can switch, all guys that can take on pretty much anyone on the opposition team, because aside from Luka, you don't have too many scoring threats. You can switch on to any of those guys and you're not too worried with the matchup. And then offensively, all of a sudden, the Clippers are starting to get those shots to fall. Again, this series is not over. The Clippers have won 2 games. The Mavericks have won 2 games. Clippers have all the momentum heading into Staples Arena. But I mean, they lost the last 2 games at Staples, so it's not like it's some kind of impenetrable fortress. But I am starting to get concerned about just the ease at which Kawhi is getting to his spots. It's very reminiscent of last year in the playoffs. Last year when the Mavericks faced the Clippers, this is why I picked the Clippers in this year's playoffs, and my mind kind of swayed after the first 2 games, but I still thought it was probably going to 7. I would have anticipated it to still go to 6 or 7 at least, and this is why, because Luka's going to get his own, and he's still doing that even hobbled, but Kawhi, when he's doing this 11 of 15, and once Paul George is not playing like Paul George did last year in the playoffs, all of a sudden the Mavericks have really no options, because instead of double teaming Kawhi and trying to take the ball out of his hands, you've got to single team him, because otherwise you're leaving wide open guys who are starting to knock down their 3-point shots, and it just leaves you with a lot of questions and a lot of question marks over what Dallas are going to do. I mean, they throw in Marjanovic to try and throw off the small ball lineup, which worked briefly, but it's not really a sustainable thing to go to, because straight away once Marjanovic came in, Batum took him off the dribble, and when Batum's taking you off the dribble and you have to worry about Kawhi and PG, that's a little bit concerning. If Batum's the guy that can take you off the dribble, then those guys are going to make you look silly, which, I mean, you don't really need me to tell you that, because it's a 7'4" guy trying to guard 2 of the best skilled players in the league, but just starting to take advantage of some of those holes in Dallas's defense, which they weren't taking advantage of as much in the first 2 games. And then offensively, Dallas have slowed down a bit, but I think a lot of that has to go to the Clippers, because a lot of the reasons Dallas were hitting all their shots in the first 2 games, which was more of my surprise. I said this, but I thought, seeing their offense stagnant, we've seen that before. Kawhi and PG, as good as they are, they can be very isolation heavy. The Clippers have been an isolation heavy ever since those guys got to LA. That's a kind of team they're still going to be and continue to be. I mean, Rondo adds some playmaking, but in general, he's not taking the ball out of their hands enough to the point where those guys aren't going to be the guys running the offense, and a lot of isolation comes from that. So their offense can get stagnant. Right now, it doesn't matter, because like I mentioned, Kawhi's getting literally anything he wants, so he can isolate 30 times a game, and he's scoring on 90% of those times. It doesn't really matter. Although their offense can be stagnant, which I said, I think defensively was the shock. Defensively, they just weren't engaged. They weren't rotating. They didn't look like they really cared to be out there the first 2 games. They were just sloppy. They were slow. They just weren't making the right reads or rotations. Now, all of a sudden, they've changed that. They've gone small. Batum's still actually providing some rim protection. He got a couple of blocks. Kawhi's still providing some rim protection. He got a couple of blocks. So you've got still that rim protection from those guys providing a little bit of that. And then with the perimeter added defense, it's a little bit scary, because it seems like if Luka's not giving you 35, if Hardaway Jr. is not giving you 20 plus, the Mavericks just don't have enough to stay with the Clippers, which is kind of what we expected. But through the first 2 games, those guys were actually up to the task. The last 2 games, the last game in particular, Luka's been injured. He's been struggling from the free throw line, like a lot, badly. I mean, it's getting to a point where it's, what are you doing out there? I'm really confused with how his free throw shooting is as bad as Andre Drummond's, when he's been hitting step back threes for fun all series long. He's been hitting shots from 30 feet off isolation, step back dribbles, threes, splash. He can hit them 5 times a game, and then he'll go 0 of 5 from the free throw line. I know he's a little bit injured, but I'm not giving him a complete pass, because even the first 3 games, he couldn't hit a free throw. And if these games do get close again, that's when we're going to start to get a little bit concerned with that free throw shooting, because this game, it didn't really matter. The Clippers had their number from the start to finish, but if a game goes down to the wire and Luka decides to miss 6 free throws out of 6 again, or something ridiculous, they might start hacker-shacking him. They might just start fouling him and sending him to the line, make those shots, turn him into Shaquille O'Neal at the guard position, which would be something else to see, seeing as he can hit literally every shot in the game. There's a lot of concerns for the Mavs right now, and it's pretty crazy how things have switched up in just the space of 2 games, and this is what can happen. Again, this could happen the other way around. The Clippers could go back to looking lost on defense, which is hard to see because a lot of the reason for them being terrible on defense early was the fact that Zubac and Beverly were getting targeted and for some reason were staying in the game for an eternity. Now all of a sudden they're out of the game and there's guys that aren't getting targeted every single possession. Anyways, the series is still tied, so the Mavericks still have a chance, but it's not looking incredibly good for them because the Clippers have figured out what they need to do and the Mavericks kind of look like the lost team all of a sudden. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like on it, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Have a good day. Catch you next time. Bye.